Don't send me back.
Not sending you anywhere but warm, ma'am.
Clamp thread.
A dying nurse on a frozen night in 1887 Wyoming is rescued by a lonely cowboy, but when the sheriff accuses him of murder, her healing hands become his only chance to survive a storm of law, greed, and love that will change the West forever. Gallows Bend, Wyoming Territory, December 1887. The wind didn't just blow that night, it argued with the earth. Snow came sideways, mean and unending, and the little depot looked like a candle about to gutter in a church with a leaky roof. I tied my sorrel to the lee of the freight shed, and felt the cold climb my bones the way regret climbs a man's years, slow at first, then all at once. The night smelled of iron rails, creosote, and something thin and brittle I knew too well, loneliness with teeth. Inside, the pot-bellied stove ticked like it had better days behind it. Perkins, the telegraph rat, was bent over his key, jaw working on a dead cigar. That's when I saw her on the bench, still as a winter doe that's given up running. Thin shawl, wet boots, a leather bag hugged to her ribs like a Bible, lips with no color left, breath coming in little ghosts. I've ridden into fights I didn't pick and winters I should have outwaited. But some moments don't ask a man's permission. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away, and if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. Perkins, I said, stir that stove like your life depends. He startled, then obeyed. I shrugged off my trail coat and laid it around the woman's shoulders. Heat has a sound when it finds the half-frozen. It's a sigh that starts somewhere you can't point to. Her eyes fluttered, showed gray, then shut again. Name's Hayes, I told her, though she was barely there to receipt it. Coulter Hayes. You're safe, ma'am. Perkins rattled the stove door. She came off the eastbound, he said. Train made Casper, then limped in. Conductor wanted to push through. She stayed. Said she had to. He looked guilty. Like cold was a sin he'd failed to stop. I ain't got rooms. I've got a ranch, I said, and a spare bunk that owes me rent. I knelt, fingers to her wrist. Pulse was a rabbit under brush. Perkins, fetch blankets, and boil water till that stove screams. Her bag sat between her boots. The leather was scuffed but cared for, brass latches polished by habit more than pride. I opened it because death doesn't mind our manners, and I meant to keep it waiting. Scalpels lived inside, wrapped in muslin. Vials labeled in a tidy hand. Laudanum, quinine, carbolic. A certificate tube. A woman with sharp tools and paper to prove it either trouble or remedy. Her eyelids trembled again. Don't, she whispered. Don't what? Don't. Send me back. Not sending you anywhere but warm, I said. Can you say your name? She fought for it, like a hook stuck under her ribs. Anna Pierce. Miss Pierce, I said, though I didn't know if it was Miss or Mrs. I'm taking you out of this wind. Perkins reappeared with 2 moth-eaten blankets and a kettle that wanted to boil about as much as a mule wants to tango. I wrapped her neat, lifted her. She was lighter than a good saddle and stiffer than a dead spruce. The storm hit me full in the teeth when I shouldered the depot door. Snow found the open collar of my shirt and slid down my back like a lie. The sorrel stamped, unhappy. Hush up, I told him. I set Anna across the saddle, mounted behind, and turned us into the white. The road from Gallows Bend to Split H is 3 miles if you're sober, and the sky's clear. That night it was an ocean. The cottonwoods along Willow Draw were iced like old men with bad beards, but they broke the wind. I kept an arm around her and felt the shiver go out of her by degrees, a good sign if you know the wrong kind of stillness. Why, help me? She asked, voice athread. Because I'm here, I said, and a man ought to be worth the ground he stands on. She tried to laugh. It broke like glass. They don't say that where I came from. Where's that? Baltimore, she said, and went away again. I got her to the ranch with my face stung and my fingers clumsy. The lantern over the porch threw a weak halo. I kicked the door open, shouldered past the chessboard I never bothered finishing, and laid her on the settle near the stove. The dog, Patch, whined once, then went quiet, head on paws like he understood triage. "Stay with me," I told her, stoking fire. "You drift, I'll yank you back." I stripped her boots' wet stockings under, toes white and dumb. Frostnip flirted with worse. The skin wasn't rotten, not yet. I warmed water, added carbolic because I'd seen feet die from less. Her eyes cracked to slits. "That smell," she managed. "Clean," I said. "Hurts like sin. You know that." "That I do," she whispered, watching my hands like a teacher marking papers. "You've done this." "Army sawbones stole the credit," I said. "Scout work, mostly. I learned to keep men alive on nights colder than this." I bathed her feet careful, as you handle a newborn calf's first breath, then wrapped them in flannel. The shivering eased when I slid my trail coat under her and my quilt over. I put coffee and molasses in a cup and thinned it to a sweet broth. She took it slow. Color returned like someone opening shutters in a dark house. "Thank you," she said, more herself now. The words met my floorboards and stood up straighter than some men. "You can keep your thanks for when you're standing," I said. "You're safe at Split H. I'm Coulter." "Anna," she said. "Just Anna." Perkins' kettle had given me the idea, so I boiled proper water, scrubbed my hands raw, and set her kit on the table. "You ride with tools," I said. "That's a story." She watched steam rise and thought on the shapes it made. "I was a nurse," she said. "Street Agnes in Baltimore. Then I reported a man who shouldn't have been a doctor. He made sure I wasn't a nurse after that. I lied to a lot of things in my life. I didn't lie to that. Then we'll call you what you are," I said. "A nurse who traveled far." Her mouth lifted, the way a hungry coyote might at a sliver of moon. "You talk like a preacher who chews tobacco." "Oh." "I talk like a man who's seen what happens when nobody does the right thing," I said. "You're welcome to my food and roof. You owe me nothing for them." She studied me, not like a woman studies a man, but like a clinician measures a pulse. It still made heat find my ears. "Your coat saved my life," she said. "I'll find a way to return it." "Keep it until winter quits being a bully," I said. "Quid pro quo can wait for spring." Patch thumped his tail. Outside, the storm chewed on the corners of the cabin and spat ice under the sill. I threw on more wood. "You run from someone?" I asked, and kept my voice where a skittish colt won't spook. "Yes," she said. "No embroidery. But I ran toward something, too." She touched the medical bag like a talisman, a place where the work matters more than the slander, where hands count more than gossip. "Then you picked the right stretch of cold dirt," I said. "We break horses and bones out here. Could use both kinds of mending." Silence settled in the good kind that warms the room. My own past tugged at my sleeve like a child wanting the last word. I set coffee on the stove back, poured her another broth, and told her a thing I didn't owe her yet. "I was engaged," I said, eyes on the blue of the flame. "Her name was Claire. She took sick in the mountains and never came down. I put a ring under the same cottonwoods I branded my first calf under. Haven't much cared for the sound of church bells since." Anna didn't say sorry. She just nodded. "Which is the best a good person can do for the dead. Make a little room for them, and don't knock over the lamp." "Loss teaches carefulness," she said. "I've been careful so long I forgot how to trust." "Trust is a thing you feed," I said. "Starve it, and it gets mean." Her hands had warmed enough to stop shaking. She opened the tube and slid out a paper with a seal. The lamplight made it more official than my country table deserved. "You don't need to read it," she said, "but I wanted to show you. There was a time when I was allowed to be what I am." "I don't need paper to believe what I see," I said, "but I'm glad you kept it." A gust hammered the north wall and tried my latch. Patch growled, low and friendly. A second later there came a different sound. Hooves, hurried, then a fist on the door. "Hayes," Tom Caffrey's voice, my foreman. "Open up, laced." I went and hauled it wide. Tom stood laced with snow like a cake that made its own weather. Behind him, two hands half carried, half dragged Billy Morrow, not yet 20. his face white under freckles that usually grinned. Blood had frozen at his belt in a red fan. Spooked herd crushed him at Box Gate, Tom said, words steaming. Couple ribs gone wrong. I think one's in his lung. Len. I didn't look at Anna. She was already moving, feet wrapped, boots back on, hair pulled tight so no stray strand would find a wound. She spoke 3 words that made the room feel a size bigger. Clear the table. We did. The kitchen became a surgery, the way a church becomes a battlefield when you're praying to keep a man. Bowls of boiled water. Carbolic. The cleanest sheets I owned. I saw her hands still a little blue at the tips, but steady like winter stars. Coulter, hold him, she said, and used my name like a rope I was glad to be. Tom, you're my second. We'll need light without smoke. Move the lamp high. You, she nodded to Jess Ortega, keep the fire up. No drafts. Billy coughed. The sound gurgled. Pink froth wet his lip. Anna's eyes flicked. Her mind counted what it saw. Fracture here, she said, fingers pressing gently along the cage. He's drowning inside. I have to open and lift the rib, drain the blood. If you have whiskey, give it to him. He won't keep enough in to matter. We had whiskey. It did its little miracle of bravery, then sat in Billy's veins blinking at the light. Anna boiled her instruments again. I wish for ether, she murmured to no one. We'll have to make do. She looked at me. You've seen war, she said, not asking. Can you keep him still? I can keep him on this earth if it's the last thing I do tonight, I said. Good, she said. Then let's earn the morning. I held the boy's wrists, murmuring barn talk you use on a skittish colt. Anna sliced with a sure economy that made even Tom go quiet. When she levered the rib, Billy screamed once, then went to a place nothing could follow. Blood welled, bright and ugly, then ran dark and relieved. She worked with an attention that didn't belong to Winter or to this poor cabin, but to some clean room in her head with white walls and rules. Clamp, she said. Thread. There. Though. It took a length of time that wasn't minutes. Then Billy breathed like a man who'd forgotten how. The froth ceased. The color in his lips came back from whatever fence line it had wandered beyond. Anna stitched him as if she were closing a letter that needed to be delivered to spring in one piece. When she finished, she sat back only enough to let her lungs remind her they existed. Then she looked at me and smiled the tired smile of a professional whose currency is life. He'll make it, she said. Tom said something Irish and holy. Jess wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and pretended it was smoke. I found a laugh I hadn't used since the army. It startled Patch so bad he barked. I put a hand on Anna's shoulder and felt heat still stored there from my coat and the work and whatever fire lives in people like her. Miss Pierce, I said, you just bought yourself all the enemies and all the friends a person can have around here. She raised an eyebrow. Which are worse? Depends who shows up first, I said, and how thirsty they are. We bedded Billy in my room because the front room had the better heat. The hands tramped back into the storm to tend the rest of the herd, leaving Tom to watch. I poured water for Anna, then, on second thought, hot chocolate Martha in town sells a tin to bachelors who like pretending they're civilized. She cupped it with both hands, blew on it until the steam curled like a cat. I meant to come west, she said, voice low, just not like this. Nothing worth doing comes like we plan, I said. The West wasn't made with a ruler. She looked toward the door as if she could see through the storm to the tracks. Dawn will tell me whether to run again. Dawn will tell you nothing new, I said. You already know. Question is whether you're tired of living small for men who deserve less of you than Winter does. That. Her eyes met mine clear now, full of a kind of humor that wears chainmail. Mr. Hayes, she said. Are you recruiting? For common sense? Always. Then I'll make you an offer. Board and food until I can manage my own in exchange for what we did tonight and more. You drive a hard bargain, I said. Sold. You didn't even ask my wage. I ain't paying you in coin alone, I said. I'm paying you in decisions. We run this work together when it's sick and when it's well. You answer to your conscience before you answer to me. If that don't suit, there's the door and the world beyond it, which you've already proven you can survive. She considered that a long moment, then nodded. I'll take that pay. We shook on it Old West contract. 2 hands and a lamp. The storm wore itself out about an hour before gray took hold of the cottonwoods. Billy slept as if the world had been negotiated on his behalf. Tom snored in the chair with his hat over his eyes. Patch dreamed and kicked at a rabbit he'd never catch. Anna dozed and woke, body remembering cold it had just forgotten. I sat by the door with my Winchester across my knees and watched the seam where plank meets jam. You get old doing that, watching seams and learning what comes through them. Somewhere between night and morning, I heard the sound I'd been waiting to hear since Perkins' first telegram about missing money 3 days back. Hooves that didn't care who heard, headed for my gate with news that never brings a smile. I stood, quiet as a man deciding not to be quiet anymore. Rest, I told Anna's sleeping shape, though maybe I said it to the part of myself that thought he could keep winter out by stacking wood and making bargains with silence. I barred the door with a breath, which is to say, I didn't bar it at all. The knock came like a debt collector. Hayes, Sheriff Dorn's voice, oiled leather. Open up. We got questions about a train payroll and a brakeman who ain't breathing. I looked at the woman I'd carried out of a storm and the boy she'd pulled back from an earlier one. I looked at the rifle in my hands, the coffee gone to mud on the stove, the lamplight, morning pretending to be a slow man. I unbarred nothing, because there was nothing to unbar, and opened to whatever the day meant to cost me. Dust, paper, firelight. Dorn's hat was black felt, brim sharpened by pride and rain. 2 deputies flanked him, both with hands near irons they hadn't earned. Behind them, Ephraim Black sat a bay with a polished bridle and the smile of a man who thought the territory was a chessboard. The wind carried a low moan through the cottonwoods. Dust curled around the corral fence like smoke deciding which direction sin ought to go. Every sound felt measured that morning, the distant hammer from Tom's forge, the lazy creak of the well crank, even the horses shifting their weight, as if careful not to interrupt the performance of power walking up to my porch. An old hound under the steps lifted his head and did not bark. He had learned there were some troubles you didn't warn a man about. You just sat close. We found a payroll safe busted open on the high bridge, Dorn said. His voice was too clean for the mud on his boots. Brakeman dead 2 spans down. Your horse's tracks near Devil's Ford. My tracks are everywhere within 20 miles, I said. You want to shoot me for walking on my own dirt. Do it straight and stop dressing it in law. Black clicked his tongue, slow and deliberate. No need for harshness. We just need testimony and cooperation. Water rights hearings tomorrow. Doesn't look good when a man of influence declines to assist the authorities. Influence. That was the word he liked best. It rolled off his teeth like sugar hiding arsenic. The man had money from rail bonds and ambition that stank of perfume and blood. Every acre he couldn't buy, he planned to drown. He kept his gloves on when he talked, as if the territory itself were contagion. Anna had drifted to the doorway with the quiet of a nurse who knows when words won't help. She wore my coat still, sleeves rolled. Her presence changed the room's math. Black's eyes slid over her like a man pricing a mirror. You're shivering, he said too pleasantly. We have rooms at the hotel. I have work here, she said. And a patient. We have a dead man, Dorn snapped. And a living man you'd like to be rid of, she said, gaze steady. If you plan to search, do it quick. You're letting my patient grow cold. That's when I knew she'd chosen us, and this place, at least for the hour. I stepped aside. They tromped mud on my floor and found nothing but tools, ledgers, and a winter's worth of hard. The air filled with the smell of wet leather and false certainty. The stove ticked. A kettle on the hob sighed like it wanted to speak up and didn't dare. Black lingered by the desk, reading numbers like he could turn them into water. He traced a finger down the ledger column, as though baptizing my debts. You're overdrawn with me, Hayes, he murmured, low enough for the deputies to miss. Sell me Willow Draw and Boxgate. I'll forgive what men of vision call temporary misunderstandings. Oh, I'm not in debt to you, I said, meaning more than money. You're in debt to the future, he said. Progress has a schedule. Progress can wait its turn like every other man. He smiled the way snakes stretch before striking. Dorn made a show of lifting blankets, knocking on the wall, peering into the flour bin like a safe might be hiding under biscuits. The deputies took turns being officious and bored. One of them, freckled and young, poked the hound with a boot. The old dog raised his lip and the boy drew back fast, flushing the color of a guilty sunrise. They left dust and the promise of return. Tom swore softly from the forge. Anna retied her apron, eyes on the floor as if she were counting knots and making an inventory of what could be spared if this turned into a siege. "They'll be back," she said, "with a paper that pretends to be truth. Then we get our own paper," I said. "One with teeth." We moved like a small army that had decided to make a stand. Anna inventoried the supplies as if Split H were a field hospital. Tonic, willow bark, sutures, clean rags in a stack that tried to be taller than need. She boiled bandages, stacked jars, and ordered chaos the way only the weary know how. Her calm steadied the place. Even the hound stopped pacing and went to sleep with his paws touching her boots. I stepped outside. The light thinned into amber. The wind had changed, carrying the taste of iron from the river and the faint sweetness of last year's hay. I saddled the roan and rode fence till dusk. The leather creaked like old bones. Meadowlarks tried out a note or two and then thought better of it. At the west pasture I found where 3 panels had been cut clean as a banker's conscience. The wire still sang with the echo of theft. Kneeling in the dust, I saw the story the ground told when it trusted you. Spare shoes on a gray foundry gelding the nail-heads half-mooned and bright. A mule with a nicked hock dragging the hoof a hair every 3rd step. And one man who cut his chaw with peppermint. That scent sticks in the cold. I'd know it again. The boot prints suggested deliberate speed. The kind of hurry a man wears when he knows the sheriff's timetable better than the sheriff. The sun dropped behind the mesa. In that turning, the world becomes honest with itself. I followed the sign a little way to be sure the trail angled toward Devil's Ford, then let it be. You can learn what you need and still know when to stop wanting more. When I got back, the cabin windows glowed soft, the kind of light that forgives a day. Through the glass, I saw Anna leaning over Tom's bandaged leg, her hair unpinned, falling like dusk around her shoulders. For a second, the sight hurt, like remembering warmth after too long in snow. Tom winced and tried to joke. Anna didn't smile. She encouraged him with efficiency, which for some men is kinder. "Keep it clean. No pride in infection," she said. "Pride belongs to men who can run upstairs." "Not many of those in this county," Tom managed. She tied off the knot with hands that did not shake. By lamplight at the Grange that night, the town danced to a fiddle that used to live in Missouri. I went because men talk more truth to music than to a badge. Anna came because Martha insisted, and because she wanted to see faces she'd be tending come spring. She wore plain wool and my coat because the night bit. Heads turned, not because she was a picture, though she was in a spare, proud way, but because she had that thing only a few people have, presence that made a room sit up straight. The Grange smelled of wood smoke, corn mash, and ambition. Old Pike played the fiddle like he was begging mercy from the devil. I took a corner table and let the room unroll. Merchants whispering about contracts, ranch hands swapping lies, Black's clerk pretending to be invisible while eavesdropping. A card game paused between the fall of one truth and the rise of another. The floorboards carried a rhythm older than law. Boots found it without trying. Martha introduced Anna to whoever mattered, which in a small place is everyone. "Nurse," she said, the words seasoning the air. There were nods heavy with gratitude in advance and fear in reserve. A woman holding a baby placed the child in Anna's arms for a moment like a test and a blessing. The baby reached up and caught a lock of Anna's hair, refused to let go, then laughed in that hiccuping way infants forgive the world. I watched Black's clerk watch that. Some men fear guns and not goodness. He was the second kind. I was halfway through a tune when Jess burst in with blood on his collar and no music in his mouth. The door smacked the wall behind him, and the room caught its breath. "Bridge Canyon," he gasped. "I found Caleb. Shot. They left him for coyotes." The fiddle went quiet mid-note. You could hear Hart stumble. I was at the door before my hat cleared the peg. Anna was in the wagon before I could say no. Tom called after us to take the lantern and the shovel, and we did, because habit is another name for love. We rolled out under stars so cold they tinkled. The road cut black between mesquite and frost. The horses blew steam that drifted behind us like a second set of ghosts. I didn't speak. Words would have been a kind of vanity. Caleb had been my rider since he was 16, too eager by half and decent to the bone. I taught him to shoe a horse, and to lie just enough to keep breathing. He could sing bawdy or hymns, and make either sound sincere. He once carried a half-broke mare across a flooded arroyo, one hoof at a time, and apologized to her for his language. We found him where the shale sloped like a shrugged shoulder. He lay there like something the earth hadn't decided to keep. 2 holes in him. One in the chest would have been enough. The second in the back was for malice. His hat had rolled a little way off and come to rest, brim down, as if even felt can be ashamed. Anna knelt, touched the blood, then sniffed the wind like a tracker. They shot him at close range, she said. Cordite. Not all rifles here burn clean. She looked out over the dark like she could read it. This was a message. We searched the ground. Near a scrub oak I found a cartridge that didn't belong to the kind of men who drink at Riley's. It had a bright crimp and factory pride. 2 sets of prints led away one, the drag of a man who'd ridden with his stirrups too long and paid for it in his knees, one with a turned-in right foot. I wanted them to be someone else's. The night would not be so kind. The moon rose pale over the canyon rim, and the wind carried a cry from far down Coyote or Soul. I couldn't tell. I say prayers when I must, but I have a different vocabulary for the dead I knew. I buried Caleb with the words I save for men who worked honest. You did your part. The rest is on us. Dirt hit the coffin lid like judgment, even though we hadn't a coffin, just planks and blanket. The sound still finds a box to knock. Anna stood back and did not try to make me wise. When I finished, she set her hand on my shoulder, a pressure just enough to mean still here. The lantern hissed. Somewhere a rock shifted under its own old weight. We rode back slow because grief doesn't like to be jostled. At the ranch I penned the roan, then carried Caleb's saddle inside and set it on a chair as if it could rest. Men drifted by through the night to put a hand on the leather and leave in silence. It's a ritual you don't invent, but inherit. The next day, Dorn arrested me for the payroll robbery he knew damn well I didn't commit. He had paper and a judge he'd leaned on. The warrant smelled of Black's ink. They shackled me at dawn while Tom shouted protest and the chickens scattered like rumor. I didn't fight. There's a dignity in saving your strength for the right hour. The cell smelled of old beans and older fear. Light came through bars thick with rust. Stripes of gold on stone. I'd slept in worse during the war, but never with this much innocence in the air. From somewhere up the hall, a man coughed the cough of someone who'd learned to owe the county for rations. On the wall, someone had scratched a name and a date, and then scratched the name out again, regret made visible. Time in jail moves in 2 speeds, all at once and not at all. I counted bricks, names of cattle, the times Black had said influence, like an unearned sacrament. The deputy on duty tried to be friendly until he remembered I wasn't allowed friends. He slid me a mug of coffee that pretended to be coffee, and a biscuit that had learned the wrong lessons from Stone. Anna watched them take me, and did not waste breath crying out. She put that breath into a plan. From the jailhouse window, through iron lace and bad glass, I saw her ride out with Red Willow Joe, a Paiute tracker who owes me for a winter I bought his child shoes. She rode like purpose itself, small, straight-backed, unbothered by the jeers from the boardwalk. The deputies laughed. I pitied them for not knowing history was watching. The day kneaded itself into evening, and then into a cold that held its breath. The stove at the far end of the hallway failed at its one job. I wrapped my coat tighter and thought about the shape of loss, how it takes the outline of what you love, and then grows teeth. When the lamp guttered, I sang a verse of a hymn under my breath and surprised myself by remembering all of it. That failure is either incompetence or design. I don't know which is worse for a man with a badge. Attaway looked from the pouch to her to Black's lawyer, who'd shown up like a shadow that paid rent in whispers. The judge's face did a slow thing I remember from war, a man swapping one set of orders for another. He removed his spectacles, breathed fog on them, and said, "Release Mr. Hayes. We'll hear water rights tomorrow after he's had time to wash the stink of this jail from his shirt." And if they didn't like it. The deputies muttered, Dorn's jaw twitched, and Black's lawyer wrote something elegant and venomous in his notebook. The town liked it fine. When the news spread, you could feel the street's heartbeat change, small folk remembering the law might still favor them for a breath. The deputy brought the keys like a man delivering a bad harvest. The shackle bit my wrist one last time, as if to say, "We'll see you again." I stepped out, the hallway longer and shorter than it had been. Outside, the sky was iron turning to pewter, and a faint snow began that wouldn't commit. I walked into the street, and was a free man under a sky that didn't care. Snowmelt glittered in the ruts. The bell at the livery rang twice for no reason. A dog I didn't know wagged its tail like this was the end of the sermon, and a biscuit would follow. People watched without pretending not to. Anna stood there with her medical bag, and an expression I've only seen on a handful of faces. The relief that follows when you gamble your last coin on a truth, and the wheel agrees. The wind worried a loose strand of hair across her brow. She didn't fix it. "I told myself I wouldn't interfere with the law," she said. I lied. "Sometimes the law needs help remembering what it's for," I said. She looked up, tired but bright. The kind of brightness that comes from courage, not luck. It was the best humor I had. We walked back along Canyon Street with the kind of slowness that asks for no favors. The telegraph clacked in the office on the corner, turning facts into rumor faster than feet could carry them. From the barber's came the clean sound of scissors telling hair the truth. A boy chased a hoop and stopped dead to salute me with a seriousness that made his dog sneeze. The dog sneezed again for emphasis. At the ranch, the lamp in the window burned steady, a small thing, but it meant we were still here. Tom had set 2 plates out as if certainty were a skill a man could practice. Jess sat by the door with his hat on his knee like a churchgoer. Nobody said sorry about Caleb. We were saving the right words for the right place. After supper, when the house had found its quiet, I stepped onto the stoop. The night had that hollow sound winter keeps for itself. Across the yard, the north barn hulked black ribs against a dim sky, a cathedral of absence. I set my hand on the charred beam I'd dragged aside, the one with my palm burned into it from that panicked pull. The wood was cold. The print fit me still. Inside, Anna was writing by lamplight, copying out the affidavits, drying the photograph plates by the stove, noting the hour the frost had lifted from the corrals and the temperature the sick foal had begun to sweat. I stood in the doorway and watched the nib scratch. She did not ask if I wanted to talk. That was her mercy. "Tomorrow," she said after a while, not looking up, "we'll need to leave by first light. If Attaway's clerk is sober, we can file for a temporary injunction before Black finds a new paper." "Tomorrow," I agreed. I didn't say thank you. I had already said it too many ways to count. Sleep came in pieces. When I woke toward dawn, the stove had fallen to a red eye, and the room was the color of cooled iron. Anna had put a blanket over my shoulders at some hour I'd missed. I poured coffee and burned my tongue and decided not to teach the cup a lesson for it. At first light I saddled the roan. Frost made lace on the stirrup leathers. The hound leaned his weight against my boot, and I told him he was a fool and a saint. Anna came out with her hat pinned low, and the medical bag replaced by a folio tied with string. We rode toward town with the sun walking alongside like it hadn't been invited. What happened the next day belongs to the ledger of Part 3, but the truth of it was planted here in the dust on my floor from Dorn's boots, in Black's finger sliding down my debts like baptism, in the peppermint tang on a thief's chaw, in Anna's hair catching fire and her not missing a beat, in Caleb's hat brimmed down as if felt could feel shame, in a pouch that smelled of river weed and fear, in Attaway fogging his spectacles before changing his mind. Men like Black think territory is a chessboard. They forget who carves the pieces. They forget how the wood remembers the tree. I sometimes think the day started long before any of us woke, the moment the river decided it was tired of being described by liars. It sent a scent of peppermint across cold air, and it kept the mud soft where a certain boot would slip, and it clung to a pouch with a bank's stamp just long enough for a nurse to find it by feel. I have seen worse conspirators than water. The sun bled low that evening, laying gold across her cheek, and the iron bars behind me in memory, those bars still in my head though I'd stepped past them. The world was full of wounds and mercy both, and for that moment I could tell them apart. Somewhere behind us the telegraph clacked news that would twist itself by morning. But for that heartbeat, Under that failing light, we were exactly what we claimed to be, two souls still standing. I banked the stove. She capped the ink. Outside, the wind folded itself and lay down. In that hush, I heard the smallest sound a house can make. Timber easing, a nail consenting to its task. If there's a scripture for ranches, that's in it. We did not sleep better for having chosen our side. We slept truer. That has to be enough in this country. And if anyone asks when the hearing really began, the water rights and the arguments and the maps, I'll tell them it started when a woman said, "You're letting my patient grow cold," and a sheriff lowered his eyes because the truth had found a voice that did not need a badge. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. The hearing and the river. The hearing was a farce until it wasn't. The courthouse smelled of ink, sweat, and the dust of older arguments. Flies droned in the high windows where sunlight pooled on cracked glass. The stove in the corner coughed heat like an old man clearing his throat, then went back to sulking. Outside, wagon wheels clattered over the frozen street, and every sound carried like the whole town had stopped breathing, waiting for a verdict that might decide its own thirst. Even the bell at the livery, famous for ringing twice when nobody asked it to, held its tongue. Black's maps were slick, all colored lines and promises. He spread them across the oak table, the way a magician lays down cards before a mark, palms floating, cuffs innocent, smile paid for. Blue ink for the river, red for his diversions, neat little arrows showing progress, his kind of progress, running straight toward his property line. He called it rationalization, as if reason could be fenced and pumped, as if a thing became true because you could draw it tidy. What he meant was simpler. His pumps would drink first, and our cattle would pray for rain. He spoke with the calm assurance that money breeds, using phrases borrowed from engineers who had never seen a dry creekbed head, fall, loss, gain like water, were a ledger, and men a rounding error. "Gentlemen," he said, "we must think beyond sentiment. Water left to meander serves no one. Harnessed, it serves all." His eyes flicked toward me on all. Dorn, seated beside him, didn't blink, he just sat there, a statue carved from someone else's conscience, his badge catching a dull glint of winter light. His hat brim shadowed the part of him that should have been a man. The clerk dipped his pen in sand instead of blotter. That's how old the court was. The quill squeaked over parchment, making a sound like a mouse writing its last will. Attaway, up on the bench, had the patience of a wind-carved rock. He watched the maps the way a shepherd watches a wolf explain etiquette. When my turn came, my throat felt like gravel. I spoke plain, no flourishes, that the land remembers, that rivers move the way men breathe, interrupt them, and they choke, that a ranch without water is a parable with no moral except leave. My words dropped like stones into mud. No one likes mud until they need the tracks it keeps for them. Black's lawyer, a young man with a part so straight it looked measured with a plumb line, smiled at me the way a tailor smiles at a customer who can't afford the coat. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "do you claim expertise in hydrology?" "I claim expertise in thirst," I said, "and fences, and burying calves that didn't get what they needed in time." He wrote something down like he just caught me confessing to being alive. Then Anna stood. The room, half bored until that moment, straightened. Chairs stopped creaking. Even the flies reconsidered their route. She carried no notes, no credentials beyond the steadiness in her eyes. She testified to facts no man there had bothered to see. The silt load after last spring's melt, the seasonal eddies that made Devil's Ford a liar, the way willow roots held the bank exactly where Black wanted to dig. She described current like a body's pulse, what it does when fever rises, where it hides when shock sets in. She wasn't a surveyor, she was better. She had lived among broken bodies and learned how systems fail. While she spoke, her hands rested lightly on the rail, fingers stained with ink from copying affidavits through the night. Judge Attaway listened in that still way of his one brow raised, quill frozen above parchment. Even Black's lawyer stopped his scribbling to watch her draw invisible lines through the air, redrawing the map by truth alone. "You claim these eddies are seasonal," the young lawyer said, finding his posture again. "How can you be certain of their return?" Because the moon returns, she said. Because meltwater remembers the same rocks every year and rehearses the same arguments with them. Because I've walked that ford in 3 seasons and fell into it in a 4th. A slice of laughter cut the room's tension and died quickly, unsure of its welcome. She didn't smile. If you plant your pipe where the bank is braided with roots, you'll undermine the very weave that holds your project together. It will collapse the way a fevered man collapses when somebody decides his legs are unnecessary. Attaway's quill trembled once, a tremor I mistook for age until I saw where his eyes had gone back to those tidy red arrows pointing at the willow line. We might have won right then if not for the fire. It began as a smear of gray on the horizon, too low for cloud. Someone at the window muttered, "Smoke over Split H." My heart fell before I could stand. The courtroom blurred lawyers shouting, boots scraping wood, and by the time I reached the door, the wind had already found its teeth. I caught Anna's sleeve on the way out. "Stay," I said, meaning be safe, meaning I can't lose you, and everything else today. She shook me off with a nod that said I'm coming because that's what coming is. We rode hard. The horses knew the way without rein. Snow clung to the shaded gullies, but the wind ran hot from the east, carrying the smell of hay and terror sweet and metallic, the scent of a story choosing its ending. By the time the ranch came into view, flames had already crowned the north barn, a tower of orange devouring the sky. Sparks leapt as if joy had been repurposed for ruin. The world turned to noise. Sparks stung like hornets. Men shouted the names of animals louder than prayers. The pump handle went up and down, like a metronome keeping time for panic. We got the cattle out half wild. Bawling against the light lost the tack, saved the house by a miracle named water. A sack of oats burst. The kernels popped in the heat like stubborn punctuation. Anna hauled buckets with a steadiness that should be written down somewhere. Her skirt caught fire once. She stomped it out without breaking rhythm. She bound Tom's forearm with the hem she'd just sacrificed, tied the knot with her teeth, and went back to passing water. I burned my right palm pulling a gelding free, the same horse that had carried her from the depot months ago. Choices are a chain, and that one linked. When the roof fell, the sound was a sermon. The wind swallowed the end of it. Then silence, except for the hiss of wet ash and the occasional pop of timber confessing its last sin. We stood in ruin, glowing red as coals of judgment. Every face wore the same soot mask, equal parts fury and fatigue. The hound limped out from under the porch with an ear singed and looked at me like, "Don't you dare apologize." Afterward I sat on the stoop and watched sparks drift upward, fade, and die in the new darkness. The night smelled of smoke and lesson. "I made a mistake," I said. "I trusted process when I should have guarded home." Len, she sat beside me, soot streaking her face in patterns that looked like war paint and mercy. Her eyes caught the glow of the dying embers. "You chose to be seen as a citizen, not a gun," she said quietly. "That's not a mistake. It's a cost." Her words hung there, warm and sharp. The wind softened, carrying the faint metallic tang of snow about to fall. We didn't speak again for a long while. Somewhere in the dark a calf bawled for its mother and got no answer. Somewhere else a board sighed, as if it had been waiting years to be set down. Dawn brought Dorn with a warrant that stank like fish left in the Sunday. The frost squeaked beneath his boots as he dismounted. His deputies tried to look sympathetic and succeeded only at looking fed. He read in that sanctimonious drawl of his, "The court enjoins you from diverting the river pending adjudication." He might as well have said, "Black gets your water until the judge forgets your name." He handed me the paper as if it weighed more than iron. I took it barehanded. The burns on my palm sang. When they rode off, Anna watched their silhouettes dissolve into morning fog. Her jaw worked once, a small grind of teeth against patience. "What will you do?" she asked. "What I always do," I said. "Count what's left and start from there." That, what was left. A house that smelled of smoke and coffee. A well that still drew. Half our feed. A town that could be turned or could be tired. A woman who had decided to be brave in our direction. We moved to the lowest point, literally and otherwise. The creek shrank daily, a thin silver thread over black stone. Cattle stood on the bank bawling for a river they could see but not drink. Men sagged. Coffers slid toward noise where money used to be. I sent half the hands to neighboring spreads to earn winter wages and keep their children fed. That's a thing the papers never print, that love is sometimes a ledger. Ode to the living. One more day. The nights grew long. Wind moaned through the barn's skeleton. Smoke clung to everything. Clothes, skin, hope. I mended harness by lamplight until my fingers cramped, just to keep them busy enough not to tremble. I rewrapped the same strap 3 times and finally admitted it wasn't leather that needed fixing. Anna stitched burns and silence with equal skill. She never complained of cold, though her breath smoked white each dawn. Sometimes I'd catch her rubbing her hands as if the cold had settled in her bones and rented the place month to month. She'd stop when she noticed me noticing. Then came the morning she saddled up with Red Willow Joe. "We need proof," she said, tucking the camera case into her saddlebag. "Rumor won't hold water in court." She smiled at her own pun. I didn't, because fear makes a man humorless, and because I didn't know how to bless courage without making it heavier. They rode into country that eats the clumsy. Devil's Ford in winter is a throat the river pretends friendship until the ice forgets its duty. Joe had a way with tracks I've only seen in men who learned to read before they learned letters. He pointed at nothing I could see and said, "2 men," and then named the way one would limp in old age. Anna rode slight and stubborn, keeping pace because she had decided not to be left behind by the century. By noon the clouds lowered, mean and gray. I waited by the stove, pacing tracks into the floorboards, each creak a prayer I didn't name. Tom dozed in a chair with a pistol on his lap like a cat. Jess reshaped a horseshoe he didn't need to reshape. The hound slept and dreamed, feet twitching towards someplace better. They came back near dusk, blue and shaking. Joe carried her off the horse like she weighed less than his guilt. Her lips were the color of storm steel. "Ice gave way," he rasped. But she kept the camera dry. He meant it as praise. I heard it as madness. We wrapped her in blankets and poured whiskey like medicine. Her eyes rolled once, then lit again like lamps that had been turned down too far. "Got what we needed," she whispered. Inside her coat were photographs, wet but legible, of Black's men laying pipe across land they hadn't leased. They were good pictures in the way a bruise is good at telling the truth. Grainy, undeniable, ugly enough to be believed. In the same pocket, affidavits from 2 homesteaders forced to sell, and a torn ledger page from a subcontractor's book names and payoffs written in Black's tidy hand. The page smelled of oil, sweat, and the smugness of a man who never imagined losing paper could matter. I took those papers to Attaway with burns on my hands and smoke in my voice. The courthouse felt smaller this time, as if it knew shame. The pewter sky pushed on the windows. A boy with ink on his nose tried to take my hat and failed politely. Attaway read slowly, lips moving, the tick of his pocket watch loud as gunfire. He paused over the photograph, where a man with a peppermint habit had leaned into frame without knowing it, the cut of his jaw a match for the boots that had cut my fence. "You could have brought me this yesterday," he said. "I had a fire," I said. He looked up, eyes rimmed red from either age or conscience. "Everyone's got a fire, Mr. Hayes. The question is which one they let burn." Then he signed what needed signing and summoned a federal marshal whose badge didn't answer to Dorn. The marshal wore his authority like an old coat patched, warm, uninterestingly real. He didn't smile, and therefore earned mine. When the papers were served, Black smiled, a cold, professional thing that never reached his eyes. "You think this ends in court?" he murmured as the marshal handed him the writ. "Everything ends in water, Mr. Hayes, one way or another." I didn't answer. Some threats aren't worth echoing, and besides, he'd stumbled close to the truth without deserving it. That night the cattle pressed against the frozen bank and lowed like a choir begging water to remember its job. Steam rose from their nostrils, ghostly under starlight. The river made a brittle sound beneath the crusted ice, as if debating escape. A fox ghosted upstream, as if it had been born from the very frost. I stood where it narrowed, my breath joining theirs, and wondered what a man owes land that has kept him alive. Debt is a quiet beast. Feed it poorly, it grows teeth. Feed it well, it lies down and lets you sleep. Anna came out and stood beside me, wrapped in my coat. The moon painted her hair silver. Her hand brushed mine accidentally, or not, and lingered long enough to remind me we were still flesh, not just beliefs with boots on. "You can leave," I said. "This isn't your fight." She turned her face toward the sound of the river, not toward me. "It became my fight when I crossed your threshold, and you didn't ask for anything in return." "Oh." Her voice was calm, but trembled at the edges like thin ice. "I don't know what kind of man that makes you," she said, "but I know what kind of woman I want to be because of it." "Careful," I said. "That sounds like trust." "It is," she said, "and terror." The wind moved between us, carrying the smell of wet ash and winter grass. We didn't touch. We didn't need to. Some vows are spoken without church or paper, only breath in cold air and eyes that refuse to look away. The river made its case to the moon, and the moon, being older than law, listened. The days that followed blurred into a hard kind of peace. The federal marshal froze Black's pumps, posted notices, and rode east. Justice, for once, moved quickly. But the land remembers even victories as scars. The north barn stood black and gutted a monument to lessons learned late. I kept the charred beam with my handprint burned into it. Sometimes you need to see the mark to remember what it cost. Men touched it when they passed, the way soldiers touch gates, leaving barrack. Anna healed slow. Fever took her for a night, shaking, delirious, muttering about river currents, and moral ones too. I sat by her bed, changing compresses until dawn. The lamplight made her look younger and older at the same time. The hound slept under the bed and dreamed his warfare. Outside, frost wrote its own opinions on the window. When she woke clear-eyed, she found my bandaged hand resting near hers. "You'll ruin that palm if you keep using it," she said. "It's already ruined," I told her, "but it still holds." She smiled then, small, tired, real. The kind of smile a man puts away for later and takes out when the sky forgets its color. Outside, the thaw began early. Streams whispered under the ice like secrets testing their freedom. The first geese cut north, black wings against pale sky. Life, stubborn as ever, kept its schedule. Somewhere, a shovel hit unfrozen dirt, and the sound went through me like a promise. By month's end, Attaway's ruling came down. The river stayed public. Black appealed, of course, but the tide had turned. Men who'd once feared him started looking me in the eye again. The preacher spoke of stewardship. The saloon spoke of odds. Both meant hope, dressed for different crowds. I rode the boundary one blue afternoon and found where someone had tried to splice new wire into old carefully, as if to say, "I'm not your enemy. I'm just hungry." I fixed it and left a sack of feed on the inside of the fence where a man could mistake charity for a miscount. Some victories don't fit in a ledger. One evening, long after the noise died down, I rode out to the ridge above Devil's Ford. The water ran clear again, quick and cold, as if eager to forget men's quarrels. Anna followed on the roan, bundled in a shawl that still smelled faintly of smoke and lavender. We dismounted by the willows whose roots she'd once defended in court. The air was clean enough to hurt. She crouched, letting her fingers trail through the current. "Feels different," she said. "It's freer," I said. "Maybe that's the same thing." She looked up at me then, and the setting sun caught her eyes the color of wet stone. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. "Every day," I said. "Then I look around and remember there's nowhere left worth leaving for." She stood, brushed her hands dry, and nodded as if that settled it. "Then I'll stay a while longer." We walked downstream a little, picking our way over stones the river had polished for us without knowing our names. She told me about a boy she'd treated back east, who had lived because a nurse had insisted on washing hands. I told her about a steer that had lived because a man had insisted on staying up all night to see if living would be chosen. We both laughed at how simple and expensive those stories were. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of thawed earth and wood smoke from distant homesteads. I thought of the barn we'd rebuild come spring, the herd we'd piece back together, the water that would keep us alive if we treated it right, and of her standing there between ruin and renewal, the calm center of all the noise. When darkness finally settled, we mounted up. The moon rose over the river, full and forgiving. Behind us lay the ashes of what we'd lost. Ahead, the slow work of beginning again. The horses walked easy, hooves crunching frost. Each breath hung in the air a little longer than it should, like the world itself reluctant to let go of warmth. Back at the ranch, the lamp in the window burned steady, a small thing, but it meant we were still here. I swung down first, helped her dismount, though she didn't need it. For a moment we stood close, the quiet between us thicker than speech. "Thank you," I said, not sure which of 100 debts I meant. She answered without looking up. "Then make it mean something." I promised her I would not in words, but in the way I set the lamp higher, in the way I mended the fence come morning, in the way I let the river run its course, and swore never again to forget which battles mattered most. I promised by showing up. The hearing had been a farce until it wasn't. The fire had been ruin until it taught us the shape of endurance. And the river faithless, faithful river kept flowing, same as ever, carrying our reflection down toward whatever waited beyond the bend. Some nights, when the wind slides through the valley just right, it sounds like water laughing. Maybe that's memory. Maybe that's mercy. Either way, I listen. "Hey there. Friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. Your body will thank you." Common water. Attaway's injunction froze Black's pumps at noon the next day, the sun sharp as judgment on tin and glass. His men stood idle at first, then ugly, like wolves realizing the fence had teeth. The marshal read from the paper like it was scripture, and for once the town believed. The ink on the order gleamed wet and final. Black's empire of noise fell silent except for the wind whistling through pipe mouths suddenly dry. The pipes themselves looked ashamed, mouths gaping like fish, dragged up onto gravel to think about their sins. Black pivoted toward the crowd, coat immaculate, expression carved from ambition and disdain. "You can't stop progress," he said. "You can only delay it." "Then let's delay it till spring," I answered. "We'll see whose calves live." Laughter rippled low through the farmer's grim, tired laughter that smelled of winter and hope worn thin. He turned his gaze toward Anna, smiling as though pity were currency. "You could have had a position at my company hospital," he said. "A proper wage, proper tools, proper respect. Instead, you choose this." She didn't flinch. "This saved a boy's life last night while you were moving ink across maps." It landed clean. Even Dorn looked down. The noose tightened on everyone that winter. Supplies ran thin. Tempers thinned faster. Men fought over rations of coffee, over salt, over the ghost of fairness. By the third week I found myself halfway to breaking a man's jaw just for chewing loud, a sure sign a man ought to go split wood or pray. I did both. The axe bit pine with the rhythm of confession. My palms cracked open and bled a little. I kept swinging. The air smelled of pitch and repentance. Splinters flew. Somewhere a hawk peeled the sky in two. I let the counting keep me honest. 12 strokes per billet, 2 billets per armload, 3 armloads to forget a grievance I had no right to carry. Anna found me there. Sleeves rolled, hair tied back, a strip of linen slung like a banner across her shoulder. She said nothing at first. She just took my hands, examined the rawness, and began cleaning the burns with steady fingers. "You carry more than your share," she said at last. "It's my share," I said, though I knew she was right. Leadership is mostly a bad back and a full ledger of quiet apologies. That night we planned like thieves and prayed like farmers. The marshal agreed to escort a new survey at dawn. We decided the town would walk to the river together, old men, children, mothers, ranch hands with buckets, and a banner that read, "Common water, not a gun among us." If Black wanted blood, he'd have to sign his name to it. We marched at first light. The cold cut deep, a knife that didn't care whose skin it took. The sun came slow, like an afterthought, gold leaking across the frost. Breath steamed from horses and people alike, a procession of ghosts moving toward the sound of the river. The leather of the buckets creaked, chains rattled. Boots kept a beat older than law. Tom carried the banner, stiff as a church pew and twice as solemn. He looked like a man who wished it were a rifle, and knew why it wasn't. At the water's edge, we formed a chain hands to buckets, buckets to beasts. The river was shallow, half frozen, but it gave enough for what we needed. We watered the cattle that could be led within reach. It was messy, slow, human, the exact opposite of Black's tidy pipes. Mud splashed. Boots sank. Someone slipped and laughed. Someone else cried quietly into the cold. I remember a girl with a red scarf, sleeves too long, eyes too grave for 9. She tugged at a bucket twice her weight, teeth clenched against the cold. When she lost her footing, Anna caught the handle on the downswing and let the girl keep the credit. "That's yours," Anna said, and in the girl's face, I saw a kind of freedom you can't buy. Newsmen scribbled. One of them, a quiet fellow from Denver, sketched Anna bending to hand a bucket to a boy missing 2 fingers from frostbite last year. That picture, printed 2 days later, did more good than every speech I'd ever given. It made the fight visible. The boy's stump showed plain, not for pity but for proof, the way a scar speaks the language of what happened and what didn't kill you. By mid-morning, Black's crew arrived with wrenches, cameras, and a sneer. They looked like a brass band of industry out of tune. Dorn puffed up behind them, chest full of borrowed authority, his badge catching light like a lure. "This interference with lawful improvement stops now," he barked. "You're under arrest if you don't clear this riverbank." "Lo." The marshal didn't even blink. "Stand down, Sheriff," he said, voice calm as cold steel. "You're enjoined too." 6 words. And just like that, the temperature of the morning changed. Dorn's hand drifted toward his revolver. Jess stepped between him and the town with nothing but a look. Sometimes that's all it takes to stop a war, the steady eyes of a man who's already decided not to die quietly. Behind Jess, old Mr. Garvey, the one who hadn't spoken above a whisper since Antietam, lifted his bucket and very carefully kept passing it down the line. The sound of water slapping tin rang louder than threats. I watched the crew's bravado leak away with their breath. We got through the day without gunfire, which in Wyoming counts as a miracle. The crowd broke apart slow, half in disbelief, half in pride. The banner hung limp and wet, letters bleeding into each other, but still legible enough to matter. That night, under a sky full of cold diamonds, I finally asked what I'd been holding back like water behind a dam. "Anna Pierce," I said, stupid formal, "stay. Not because I ask it, but because you want it. Stay. We'll do this work together, eat the cost together, and build something that lasts longer than either of us." Her face was lit by the lantern, her eyes catching a shimmer of gold that belonged to firelight and faith. She looked at me with tenderness that had iron under it. "Coulter Hayes," she said, slow and clear. "Yes, but hear me. If you ever treat my work as less, my judgment as second, I'll saddle before the coffee boils and never look back." "I'll build a faster stove," I said. She laughed, a sound that belonged in a warmer room. We didn't talk about dates or rings. Our oath was plainer: shared work at dawn, shared ledger at dusk, shared silences in between that didn't bruise. The weeks that followed were made of hard labor and small mercies. We patched fences, rebuilt the north barn, and cut willows to reroot the banks where Black's men had dug too deep. The days had the rhythm of necessity, every nail driven, every hoof trimmed, every bale stacked felt like defiance. At night, I walked the river with a lantern, checking the ice edges where the current chewed through. More than once, I found traps sprung by the cold calves nosing where they shouldn't, broken branches masquerading as footing, a stretch of ice that pretended to hold. I prodded, tested, learned the river's winter grammar, the dark shine that meant hollow, the faint hiss beneath that meant move your feet. The townsfolk changed too. The anger cooled into endurance. Bread reappeared on tables. Children played near the forge again, inventing games that involved not stepping on shadows, their way of telling fate to try them. Anna turned part of the bunkhouse into a clinic, treating frostbite, childbirth, and all the quiet hurts that never made it to the doctor. Tom mended plows and spirits in equal measure. Jess stood guard at the well like a carved saint, patient and dangerous. On Thursdays, the Grange smelled of carbolic and coffee. Mothers brought babies wrapped in quilts. Men brought their pride in with their wounds, pretending to be accidents. Anna taught them to wash hands like it mattered, which it did. She showed Jess how to stitch a gash without sewing it shut, angry. "Leave room for swelling," she said. "Flesh is stubborn." He nodded and whispered, "So's hope." They grinned at each other the way two people do when they've just discovered a sane rule in a wild place. Black, of course, didn't quit. He sued again. He hired men to spread rumor that we'd stolen water, falsified ledgers, bribed the marshal. One night someone cut the ropes on the haystacks, scattering feed across the field like shredded currency. Another night, someone nailed a note to the gate, "Progress is coming." We gathered the scattered hay in silence. By dawn, the field looked whole again, and whoever had written that note learned something important about us. We didn't scare easy. At the tavern the next day, a fight almost started and almost ended poorly. One of Black's hands called Anna a saint with dirty hands and meant it like a curse. Tom's fist curled halfway to a point of theology. I stepped between them and bought a round I couldn't afford. "A toast," I said, loud enough to catch the room. "To clean water and clean hands, and knowing which one you need first." Laughter relieved the tension like a pressure valve. Even the insult melted into its own foolishness. Each evening, Anna kept a journal by lamplight weather, water level, the names of calves born and people healed. She wrote in neat lines, as though truth itself could be preserved if written carefully enough. Sometimes I'd wake to find her asleep at the table, pen still in hand. I'd drape my coat over her shoulders and think, if there's salvation left in this country, it's written in ink like that. A storm rolled in late January, sudden and mean. Snow slanted sideways, needles and ash. The river tried to hide under a rind of ice. For 2 days the town disappeared into its own roofs. We burned brush and silence. On the 3rd day, the wind let us hear again the distant crack of ice surrendering, the groan of cottonwoods learning to bow. That afternoon, Dorn, out of office, but not out of pride, rode too close to the ford and put his horse's front legs through a weak spot. Pride is a terrible judge of ice. I was there with Jess and a coil of rope. We got the animal out. I hauled Dorn's collar with hands that remembered hating him and found the hate too heavy for cold weather. He coughed river and shame. "Could have left me," he rasped. "I thought about it," I said. "Then the river said no." He didn't thank me. He didn't have to. Some rescues are made for witnesses. Others for the ledger none of us get to read. By mid-February, the river thawed early. Cracks in the ice widened each day, water whispering underneath like gossip. The first geese flew north, their cries echoing off the valley walls. Life, stubborn and cyclical, refused to give up. Still, I knew the fight wasn't over. Black wasn't a man to fade quietly. He arrived one afternoon on a white horse, polished to arrogance. The marshal gone back east and no witness but me and the wind. "You've made your point," he said. "The papers love you, the town loves you, but love doesn't last. Money does. I can still buy you out, Hayes. Fair price for the land and the woman." I stepped down off the porch. "You just made a mistake," I said softly. "You put her name and mine in the same sentence like property." He blinked. "You think I meant—" "I don't think. I heard." He turned red, muttered something about civility, and rode off. Dust followed him like shame. That night, Anna found me staring at the dying embers in the stove. "He came," she said, not asking. "He won't again," I said. She didn't press. She just poured me coffee, her hand brushing mine briefly, and the world steadied. The last of the snow retreated up the gullies. Dirt remembered its color. The cattle quit arguing with their legs. We fixed the last of the burned rafters in the north barn and carved our initials small on the inside beam, not for posterity but for ourselves, to look up on bad days and remember who had been brave here. March brought a town meeting in the church that smelled of varnish and absolutes. The water board sat behind a borrowed table. 2 homesteaders, the storekeep, and a seamstress with spectacles that made deceit look small. We drew lots for ditch duty, calendar pinned under glass like a fragile truth. One man protested the order of names. His wife put a hand on his arm and turned complaint into nodding. The minutes were written in a hand so clear even guilt could read it. Spring came hesitant but real. Snow retreated up the canyons. Grass returned shyly to the fields. The first calf of the season stood on trembling legs, and we named it Grace. The town learned patience again. The common water banner, now patched and faded, was hung near the ford where everyone could see it fluttering between willows. The words had run together in the rain until it almost read, "Common Prayer." Maybe that's what it had always meant. Attaway's federal injunction became law by default. Black's appeals lost their shine. Investors withdrew like tide, leaving mud. He left town in a private carriage, curtains drawn. Someone said he went east to lobby Congress. Someone else said he drank himself out of relevance. Either way, the river stayed ours. The work didn't stop. Victory doesn't pay bills. We still had fences to mend, cattle to move, debts to outwait. But we did it with something new under our ribs, a steadiness I'd mistaken for hope once but knew now was something humbler. Faith. Faith not in law or luck, but in hands that keep showing up. Anna carried that faith better than anyone. She had a way of making exhaustion look like grace. Sometimes, when I'd forget how to breathe, I'd watch her across the yard, hair loose, sleeves rolled, her laugh mixing with the wind, and I'd remember why men fight for the small thing. On an evening near sunset, we sat on the rebuilt barn stoop, the boards still smelling of pine sap. The air was soft, the color of honey poured slow. From somewhere up the lane came the chime of a ladle against a pail, a domestic bell that said enough for today. She looked toward the horizon. "You think we'll really hold it? The land?" I asked. "The good of it, the fairness, the reason we started." I thought about the fire, the hearing, the buckets, the faces. "Maybe not forever," I said, "but long enough that the next fool who tries will have to dig deeper." She smiled one of those tired, contented smiles that make all the noise worth it. By summer, the Split H was breathing again. Calves fattened. The river sang. Travelers stopped by to see the place that had stood against the big men and not buckled. They left stories behind, and we let them. Legends are easier to feed than cattle. We built a new storage shed, planted lilacs near the porch, and carved a bench from the charred beam I'd saved from the fire. Anna sanded it smooth, her fingertips tracing the blackened grain. "This," she said, "was almost our ending. Maybe that's why it's worth keeping." When storms came again, they felt smaller. When the wind howled, it sounded like a familiar argument instead of a threat. We learned the patterns of survival until survival itself began to look like living. Sometimes, at dusk, I'd see the town lights from the ridge, tiny lanterns scattered like constellations finding their way home. I'd think of that first hearing, that courtroom thick with dust and arrogance, and wonder how we'd made it here. The answer was simple. We hadn't fought for profit. We'd fought for the right to belong to land, to water, to each other. One night, near harvest time, the air smelled of rain and hay and the future. Anna sat beside me on the porch, ledger in her lap, hair coming loose. A cricket kept bad time in the lavender. A moth wrote a pale circle around the lamp. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. "Every day," I said. "Then I look around and remember, there's nowhere worth leaving for." She nodded, closing the book. "Then let's stay a while longer." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the river, the same river that nearly broke us, now humming soft under the moon. Somewhere out there, the cattle breathed easy. The willows whispered. We'd built no monument, no steeple, no marker except this. Two people still standing after the worst had tried. Maybe that's all history needs to remember. The hearing had been a farce until it wasn't. The march had been madness until it worked. The fire had been ruin until it taught us to rebuild slower, wiser. And love, quiet, equal, deliberate, had grown where the ground was scorched. We didn't call it that. We didn't have to. Every dawn we rose to mend fences, share coffee, and face whatever the day brought side by side. Some vows, I've learned, don't need a church to stand. They just need work, and someone willing to do it with you. When I close my eyes, I still see that banner flapping above the water. Common water, common hearts. And I know this much. We delayed progress just long enough for mercy to catch up. If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. Equal measure. Spring came like a man who owed us money and paid half. The hills remembered green but didn't quite believe it. Calves stood on legs that argued with them, bones still making up their minds about belonging. The river swelled just enough to kiss both banks in equal measure, one brief moment of fairness before the sun began taking its cut. Attaway's ruling arrived folded and official. Split H retained historic flow. Black's diversions limited to the lower tracks. A local water board installed. Sheriff Dorn removed pending inquiry. The decision read cautious, lawyer built, but good enough to stand on. Black left town behind a matched pair of glossy bays and a cloud of vows he'd break elsewhere. His departure sounded like relief, quiet wheels over thawing mud, no goodbyes, no witnesses willing to wave. But the ranch wasn't saved by paper. It was saved by hands. We spent April hammering hope back into timber. Anna trained the men in field dressings, rolled bandages, carbolic swabs, the fine art of not dying from small mistakes. We built a small room off the bunkhouse that smelled of soap, smoke, and possibility. When she asked for gauze and antiseptic from a hospital back east, she received a box that contained both and a polite refusal folded on top. We regret we cannot support unauthorized practice. She burned the letter for heat and kept the supplies. Some nights I woke to the sound of her not crying, just breathing too carefully, like someone counting the distance between what was lost and what still lived. I'd pour her water, she'd take it, and neither of us spoke the names of the ghosts sitting at the table. Her career, my first love, we kept them fed with silence and gave them no vote. May brought wind from the south and work from every direction. Fences leaned from snow load. Roofs leaked in 2 languages. At Box Gate, a young colt reared, flipped backward, and taught me how fragile ribs can be. The world narrows when you can't draw a full breath. Sound fades, light becomes weight. Anna's hands were the world then, cool, capable, angry at mortality. "Don't make me love a man who dies in spring," she said, voice breaking only once. It felt like both a prayer and an order. I didn't die. Love, I learned, is partly the refusal to. By July, the town had changed in those small, invisible ways that end up meaning everything. The Grange now doubled as a clinic on Thursdays. The water board met weekly, 2 homesteaders, 1 rancher, and a woman with a pen sharp enough to draw blood without spilling any. The banner that once shouted "Common Water" still hung over the bridge, sun-bleached and proud. Kids touched it for luck as they crossed. I walked through those days like a man relearning peace. The smell of cut hay, the thrum of insects returning, the sound of hammers that meant rebuilding instead of retreat. Every evening, the porch filled with the kind of talk that matters: what to plant, who was courting, when the rains might come. Not speeches, just belonging. One such evening I ruined the stew by measuring with pride instead of a spoon. Anna pretended not to notice until halfway through, when her smile gave her away. I wiped my mouth, reached into my pocket, and set a small velvet box between us. Inside lay a ring that had belonged to my mother, a modest diamond. A band rubbed smooth where 2 lives had worn it thin. The metal still held the warmth of the woman who'd worn it through war and drought and marriage. "I'm not asking for promises you can't give," I said. "Just the one you already keep every day." She turned the ring between her fingers, watching how the lamplight found the old scratches. "I don't wear chains," she said quietly. "It's not a chain," I said. "It's a door we both hold open when the wind tries to slam it." Her smile deepened, lines at the corners of her mouth, speaking a language older than ceremony. "All right," she said, "but we marry in our work clothes. I won't be trussed up to prove a point to people who don't feed our cattle." We married on the porch as afternoon slid toward gold. Tom held the good hat. Jess played a fiddle that only knew 3 songs but meant every note. The preacher was a neighbor with enough Bible for the purpose. The wind carried our vows across the corral, through the cottonwoods, and down to the river that had nearly ended us. It was not a legend. It was better. It was ours. That night, the lantern burned low while the crickets tuned the dark. Anna set her ring on the windowsill, saying she liked to see the dawn shine through it. I watched her drift to sleep with calloused hands folded beneath her cheek and thought that maybe heaven was just the absence of dread. Summer thinned into dust. The rains hesitated, and the grass thought about dying. Each morning, Anna stood at the porch rail, watching the horizon like a healer, studying a patient she couldn't touch. "We can't fix weather," she said once, voice calm as a verdict. "We can only learn to be good under it." "Lo." I answered the way I know best, with fence posts, ledgers, and long arithmetic. How many head could graze another week? How many debts could stand another month? Marriage is mostly math done kindly. The drought tested us, but didn't take us. We rationed water fare, split hay with neighbors, and learned that generosity is a form of insurance. When one man's well went dry, 5 others lent him buckets. When our calf barn flooded after a freak storm in August, they returned the favor. The West keeps its own books. Halfway through September, a letter arrived, stamped in red wax, the seal of a hospital that had always meant no. Anna opened it at the table. The words were polite, important, almost apologetic. They wanted to study her methods, her field surgery notes, her antiseptic techniques, her way of keeping infection low with nothing but grit and vinegar. They asked for papers. She read it twice, then set it beneath the salt crock, and went back to teaching Jess how to stitch a wound that keeps moving. "Should I send a reply?" I asked later. She shrugged. "Maybe when they start sending water with their letters." But I caught the flicker in her eyes, pride, disbelief, a ghost of vindication. The next morning she did write, short and clean. "The West teaches quick hands. I hope you learn as fast." Then she sealed it, smiled at me, and handed it to the mail rider. Autumn turned the valley the color of forgiveness, russet, gold, the last green hanging on like stubborn faith. We hosted a harvest gathering on the same ground where the north barn once burned. Lanterns strung across the beams cast honey light on faces scrubbed of despair. Someone played the fiddle again, this time in tune. Children chased each other through the dust. Old men told lies that felt like blessings. When Anna passed with the stew pot, folks made room as if she carried holy fire. She laughed. And for the first time since the blizzard 2 years ago, the sound didn't have an echo of pain in it. Late that night, when the crowd had gone and the moon had climbed, we sat on the steps watching smoke curl from the cook fire. "Do you ever miss the city?" I asked. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Mostly the libraries. But they don't smell like rain on dust. Libraries don't kick like mules either. That's their loss," she said, and leaned her head against my shoulder. Winter found us ready. The ranch held steady through the first storms. The new barn roof didn't leak, the well didn't freeze. We had enough feed, enough laughter, enough silence. Every Sunday we took turns reading from whatever books we hadn't burned for warmth, old medical journals, poetry, a farmer's almanac from '74. Learning, we figured, was another kind of prayer. Sometimes I'd wake before dawn to see her writing at the kitchen table, her hair lit by the lantern's rim of gold. She was composing instructions for midwives in the next valley, diagrams for field triage, notes about herbs that actually worked. She said someday she'd send them all east, bound with string instead of pride. I told her someday the East would send something back besides money and orders. She didn't argue, but her smile said, "Don't bet on it." In early March, we rode out to the ridge where the river bent a yearly ritual now. Ice still clung to the shadowed banks, but water ran free beneath. She knelt to touch it, murmuring something I didn't catch. "What was that?" I asked. "Just telling it, thank you," she said. "For nearly drowning us? For keeping on." The wind rose and brought the smell of thawing earth, wet, raw, alive. We stood there a long while, listening to the river speak in its own grammar. Sometimes forgiveness sounds like water. By the next spring, news traveled fast. The Eastern Hospital had published her paper under her name. They called her Dr. Pierce again, the title stolen years ago, now returned without apology. When I showed her the clipping, she just said, "That'll make the girls in the Grange laugh," and went back to stitching a saddlebag. I looked at her hands, steady, sure. Same hands that had saved me from dying in the mud. "You going back?" I asked. She shook her head. "Why would I? There's work here that breathes." Some nights, when the chores are done and the lamps trimmed low, I sit on that porch where we married. The horizon hums with cicadas, and the ring on her finger catches a faint gleam of starlight. We don't ride into sunsets much. They're pretty but impractical. We ride into tomorrow, with the same gear we use today, mended, improved, earned. The West doesn't forgive. It remembers, and gives you another try if you pay cash up front. We don't promise perfect. We promise equal, and that's rarer. As for cowboy love stories, folks pass ours along with others, some truer, some prettier. If there's a moral in it, it's simple. We were saved by work, by water shared, by a woman who used a scalpel like a prayer, and by a man who learned that keeping means opening, not closing. And if you've stayed with us this far, you know what the old banner still says, faded but faithful over the bridge. Common water, common hearts. The rest is weather. We'll be good under it. Today's story is about pains that seemed to have no way out until a small ray of light changed everything. Do you believe that, even in the darkest times, there's always a miracle waiting at the end of the road? And if deep down you still believe that God is watching over you, quietly arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment, Amen, below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write it, a blessing may quietly find its way into your life. Cold. Arrival. Montana Territory. Late winter of 1884. The wind came like a thin saw through the canyon, gnawing at wood and bone. I was standing in the mouth of my forge, the coals dying to a red hush, when the stage rattled in and hissed steam like a beast that had crawled too far for too long. Snow wasn't falling so much as drifting sidewise in hard little needles, and every boot on the platform sounded hollow, as if the boards themselves were tired of the weight of folks' hopes. A young woman stepped down last, careful with her footing. She had a carpet bag and, God help her, 2 babies pressed to her in a sling that made her look smaller than the cold already had. You learn things on a frontier street in the time it takes a man to fix his hat. Who's got a bill to dodge, who's carrying a sorrow he won't set down, who is brave because there's no other way to keep living. This girl, no. Woman had all 3 braided together across her face like winter lines in old pine. The snow found the thin in her coat. One of the twins whimpered. She looked down, kissed a little brow, and stood there on the platform, as if the simple act of standing might summon the life she'd been promised in letters. That's when Silas Mercer, black gloves, city collar, a habit of looking past people, strode up with his sister Agnes, like a second shadow. He tipped his hat halfway, enough for onlookers, not enough for decency. His eyes dropped to the babies. All the warmth in him, what little I'd ever seen, drained out like spill from a cracked keg. He said something I couldn't hear over the wind. Her answer lowered, then stiffened. I caught the last pieces when the gust thinned. I wrote, she said, voice shaking but unbroken, 6 letters. I told you I had twins. I told you everything. Silas's mouth went slant. You didn't tell me what matters. I don't much care for the part of myself that listens for a fight. But there it is. A man doesn't leave the badge behind in his bones just because he took it off the belt. I stepped out into the white grit and walked toward the stage. Folks were already peeking through saloon doors. The world's always got time for a bit of someone else's ruin. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway, to keep more Wild West love stories coming. Afternoon, I said, simple as a fence post. I set myself between the wind and the woman, took off my hat to the babies first out of habit. I always figured respect ought to start with the small and then to her. Name's Jonah Rourke. Ma'am, you look like you could use a stove and a chair. Silas turned my way. He had that storekeeper smile on, the one he saves for when he's deciding whether a man is money. Jonah, he said, this is a private matter. There. It became public the minute you brought your manners out in the open, I told him, and let him hear the iron in it. I didn't raise my voice. The wind carried truth just fine. Agnes hissed air. She's been president of the ladies' circle since the silver boom, wrapped her righteousness in lace. It's indecent, she said, meaning the babies, meaning the woman's need, meaning anything that didn't ask her permission to exist. One of the twins started crying. The sound cut through me like it always does. My little girl used to cry like that when fever came in the night. You can know a thing is dead and still hear it call you from a room you can't open anymore. The woman shifted her weight. Her face was pale with travel and hunger, but the eyes hazel, steady held. Thank you, Mr. Rourke, she said. But Mr. Mercer has offered 2 nights at the hotel. After that, she stopped. After that, Silas said, isn't my concern. Oh, you used ink to make a promise, I told him. Ink's cheap to a man who doesn't pay in anything else. Color rose in his cheeks. He glanced down the platform at the faces that had turned. A few miners had come up from the creek. Ella from the boarding house was watching, hands to her apron. Old Reverend Pike stood with his coat unlatching itself because he forgets buttons when he's angry. "I won't raise another man's children," Silas said finally, as if he were donating honesty to the poor. "That's good," I said.